Hey everybody, RetroPie guy here. Today we're going to do a brief demo and review of the Logitech F310 Gamepad Controller. So what we're going to do is we'll take a closer look at this Gamepad Controller. We'll briefly go through the entire layout here, talk about all the different buttons and functions and features of the controller itself, and then we're going to test this out on a Raspberry Pi 4 running RetroPie. So I'm going to show you exactly how to set it up on RetroPie, show you exactly how to map it. We'll get into a quick gameplay demo just to test this out, and then we'll jump back out and we'll talk about the pros and cons of this particular Gamepad Controller. So let's get started. All right, so let's take a closer look at the Logitech F310 Gamepad Controller. So here on the right-hand side, you can see that we have our standard 4-button configuration. The only thing that pops out to me about this, well, it looks pretty much exactly like any other typical Gamepad controller. It is labeled differently than a Super Nintendo Gamepad controller. So typically you would have A here, B here, X up here, and Y over here for a standard Super Nintendo controller. This one is laid out and labeled ever so slightly different. So we have A here, B here, X here, and Y here. Now, how you map this is going to depend on what your personal preference is. Now, what I typically like to do with RetroPie is map it. So this is our A button over here, this is B, this is X, and this is Y, just like a Super Nintendo controller would be mapped. So, you know, that's just personal preference, but it really makes no difference what the labeling is on here. It just depends on how you actually want to utilize it. So that's the cool thing about emulation. You can customize it and make it your own. So moving on, over here we have our D-pad. Really nice layout here because this is actually raised up. If you take a look at it from here, it's not recessed in or anything. So it does feel a little bit loose, but I don't think that's going to, you know, affect the experience in any way, shape, or form. I think it just gives us a little added glide there because this does move really nicely. I always like these that are rounded out and don't have just the standard cross configuration here, because you can actually navigate on those diagonals much easier than if it was just your standard cross D-pad. So definitely like the way that this looks and feels here. We have our dual analog sticks here, both which have the button function to them. So really nice glide on these. Really nicely done. Up here we have our Logitech button, which we could actually utilize as like a home button if we wanted on RetroPie, or, you know, however you want to map this, you could definitely utilize that. We also have our start button here, our back button, which is what I'll use as my select and as my hotkey enable function. We have our mode button here. Now I also noticed, I'll show you while we're talking about modes, we have a little switch on the back so you can actually switch this to different modes. So with RetroPie, I actually use it on the X, so I don't even bother switching it over, but you can test that out if you want. I used it right here as it comes on the X side, worked perfectly. So if it isn't broke, I'm not gonna try to fix it. So moving on, that's pretty much everything on the face of the controller here. So let's jump up here to our shoulder and trigger buttons. So here you can see that we have our L and R shoulder buttons. Really nice functionality to those, really nice click to them. No issues whatsoever. Those are really responsive, so I'm happy with the way that those are put together. And then here we have our trigger buttons. We have our L and R trigger buttons. These are hinged. Typically I'm not a hinged fan, but I do really like the way that these move. I don't see any issues there, so I'm definitely anxious to see how they perform in gameplay, just to make sure that, you know, they are super responsive. But really nicely laid out for sure. Nice action on all these buttons so far. So let's jump into plugging this into our Raspberry Pi 4 running RetroPie. I'll show you how to map this and set it up with RetroPie, and then we'll jump into a gameplay demo. All right, so I'm going to show you how to set up the Logitech F310 Gamepad Controller with RetroPie. So here I'm going to be setting this up on a brand new card that hasn't had any other controllers configured on it just yet. So that's why we're going to be jumping into this welcome screen in order to do that today. So if you already have a Gamepad Controller that you're already using on your RetroPie card, then all you need to do is just hit the start button with that Gamepad Controller that's already configured. Button, jump into your main menu, drop down to configure input, and you'll automatically come to the same welcome screen that we have right here. So in order to get started here, first thing we're going to do obviously is plug in our Logitech Gamepad Controller into our Raspberry Pi's USB port. And you'll see here that it says one gamepad detected. That just means that it is getting that connection through the USB port here. So you can go ahead and hit any of these buttons on here, and you'll actually see the title of this particular controller populate in the bottom of this box, and then immediately bring us into our mapping page. So you can see that it populates that name in there and then immediately brings us right into this configuring page. So now we're going to go through all of our different mapping options here. So we're just going to follow along with the screen. So it says D-pad up, so we're going to hit our D-pad up. It says D-pad down, we're going to hit D-pad down. It says D-pad left, so hit D-pad left, and then D-pad right, hit D-pad right. So for start, we're going to go up here and hit our start button. For select, we are going to hit our select button, which I actually just use as the back button right here. And now for our A button, we're going to hit A. Now, actually, you could do this two ways. You can notice that there is a little diagram next to button A there, which actually has it mapped as this one right here, which is B on here. So you could do this however you want. The way that they have it right now on the screen is going to be that of like a Super Nintendo controller. And the way that it's done right here is actually going to be like that of a PlayStation. So it just depends on whether you want your A button down here where it's labeled on this particular controller, or if you want it over here where it's labeled as B. So I'm actually going to follow along with the buttons, you know, as they are on there and just kind of ignore the diagram that's there. So for A button, I'm going to hit A button as it's labeled on this Logitech Gamepad Controller. So for A, I'll hit A. For B, I'll hit B. For X, I'll hit X, and for Y, I'll hit Y. Now for the shoulders, it says left shoulder, so we're going to go up here, we're going to hit our left shoulder. Now for right shoulder, we're going to hit our right shoulder. For left trigger, we're going to hit our left trigger, and for right trigger, we're going to hit our right trigger. Now for left thumb, we're going to push our left thumb in. For right thumb, we're going to do the same thing on the right-hand side. And for left analog up, we'll push our left analog up. Left analog down, we'll hit left analog down. For left analog left, we'll hit left. For left analog right, we'll hit right. Same thing on the right-hand side now. So right analog up, right analog down, right analog left, right analog right. Now for the hotkey button, I'm going to actually just assign this to my select button, which is the back button here. So to actually use the hotkey function in games to exit games and jump into your collection, then you would hit the start and select at the same time to activate the hotkey. So we'll go ahead and hit the back button as our hotkey enable. And now just to save everything, we're going to hit our A button. It's going to take a second or two to load, and it should kick us back out to our main page here, and it does. So we can just test this out by just kind of scrolling through our different collections here. We'll check the D-pad, we'll check the analog sticks, everything looks good. So let's jump into a game. Let's jump into a PlayStation game just to test this out, make sure everything is good, and do a quick little gameplay demo using this particular gamepad controller. So let's find a good PlayStation game here. I'm going to jump into, what's a quick one to dive into? Let's do Medal of Honor just to test this out. Medal of Honor is a good game where you kind of utilize a little bit of all the different functions on a gamepad controller. So I think that'll be good to test out this Logitech F310.
Entdeckung geht!
Alright, so you can see from this demo that we just did here running this particular Logitech F310 Gamepad Controller, on RetroPie through a Raspberry Pi 4 that the performance on here was absolutely phenomenal. I'm really happy with it. It worked super well. We jumped into Medal of Honor, as you know. Medal of Honor is a great title to get into and test out a controller on because it's one of the rare games where you actually utilize every single button on your controller for various different functions. So you can navigate with both the D-pad as well as both the analog sticks. So it gives me a chance to really test everything out. You actually even use the button function, which a lot of games don't even use that button function on the analog stick. So this was a great game to get into. I was really happy with it. It took me a couple tries to really get a feel for exactly where everything was on here and how it functioned, just because I actually haven't been into the Medal of Honor game itself in quite some time. But all that aside, the performance of this controller was absolutely phenomenal. Really happy with it. But beyond the gameplay experience, which I was really happy with, let's talk about the quality of this gamepad controller. Everything on here is made really nicely. It's not a light controller, but it's not a heavy controller. It's got that medium weight, which is what I always prefer in a gamepad controller, because anything that's super lightweight usually means that it's poorly made and it's really just cheap plastic. So that's not the case here. Decent weight, but not too heavy. It's not something that's going to tire you out holding it by any means. Everything is laid out here nicely. All the buttons are high quality. The analog sticks perform and feel great. The D-pad on here is a little bit different than most D-pads. It's kind of raised up, which I actually like because it kind of gives it a rolling motion to it. So what's nice about this, and what I actually prefer in D-pads, is you have it filled in, so it's circular D-pad. It's not just your regular cross where you go up, down, left, or right on. This one, you're able to really get into those diagonal directions really nicely on here. So I really do like that D-pad. And the fact that it's raised just gives you a little bit better range of motion. So the buttons themselves are pretty standard, A, B, X, and Y 4-button configuration, laid out exactly how they would typically be on a gamepad controller. Really nothing too original about that. The only thing worth mentioning, as I mentioned in the actual mapping process of this video, is that it is laid out a little bit differently in terms of how it's labeled from like your typical Super Nintendo controller. It's got your A down here at the bottom, your B over here, your X over here, and your Y over here. So it is reversed from the Super Nintendo's layout. Not a big deal, it just depends on how you want to personally map it with RetroPie. So I did it exactly as it was labeled today. That's not typically how I would do a gamepad controller, because I do like my A button to be over here where it's actually labeled as B in this case, but I just wanted to follow along for the video purpose today, along with how it's labeled on this particular model. So, you could obviously switch it up. It just depends on which collection you're probably going to be playing the majority of the time. So definitely take that into consideration. Now, the way that this feels in your hands is really nice. It really is sculpted perfectly to your palms. It just grabs, all the different functions really nicely here. The only thing that I'm going to say that I don't think is a con or a negative about this gamepad controller in any way, but definitely worth mentioning because, it is a little bit different than a lot of gamepad controllers out there. When I hold this as I typically would when I first grab a gamepad controller, this is how I hold it, just to feel, exactly where my fingers and everything lines up with all the controls on here. And you can see that everything is really nice. I'm able to hit everything without straining. Super easy to navigate with. The only thing is up here. You can see my fingertips. They go well past the actual shoulder and trigger buttons here. So usually in most cases, I line up right around my fingertips on the shoulder and trigger buttons. Not a huge deal, but worth mentioning because, it was the first thing that I noticed. In order for me to adjust my grip to have my fingertips touch the trigger and shoulder buttons, right where I think they should actually hit it, I have to change my grip so much that I'm not really able to hit all of the buttons the same way. So I kind of have to pull my hands out this way in order to readjust. So the way that I would typically play this is like this. So in order to hit those shoulder trigger buttons, I'm actually hitting them with the inside of my finger more so than my fingertips. So that's definitely worth mentioning. Now, is it going to bother some people? Probably. It just depends on how picky you are and exactly how you want this to feel in your hands. So I wanted to point that out because I want everybody to be able to take away from this video exactly what I experienced. So if I could, the only thing I would change is I would make it so that maybe these are over that way a little bit better. That's the only thing though. It's not really a big deal by any means. It wouldn't make me, not want to pick up this at a store and use it as my gamepad controller. It's something that you really get used to after a few minutes of gaming on here, but again, definitely wanted to point it out to you. So beyond that though, everything is top notch here. Logitech is just a really reputable company. They're really good at putting out really great products, you know, whether it's mouses, keyboards, gamepad controllers, everything is always top notch. I think that you should definitely purchase this and you know, buy it knowing that it is a really high quality gamepad controller, super reliable. I don't think that anybody's gonna have any issues with, you know, dropping this and having it break or anything like that. It's really gonna hold up really nicely. And the reason I actually did this particular gamepad controller demo and review today was because a couple different subscribers recommended this to me. You know, it wasn't something that I was going to pick up on my own just because there's so many gamepad controllers out there. A lot of them do the same things, have the same layout. You know, they differ ever so slightly, but for the most part, you're gonna have your standard 4-button configuration, your D-pad, your start, your select, dual analog stick, shoulder, and trigger buttons. Not really a lot of variations out there unless you're going with specialty controllers. So the reason I picked this up was because it was recommended to me by a whole bunch of different people that subscribe to the channel here. So I wanted to just jump into it, test it out for myself, and put it out there because, you know, I don't want anybody to sleep on this particular brand or their controllers. You know, it's not something that really pops off the shelf in my opinion. There's nothing flashy about it, but it's reliable and it's definitely high quality. So don't hesitate to pick up one of these. I'll put a direct link in the description below if you want to jump over to Amazon, pick up one of these guys. They're really high quality, really reliable. I can't say enough nice things about them. So that's gonna do it for today. If you enjoyed this video, smash the like button. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. We do a whole bunch of different product reviews, gameplay demos, tutorials, just a little bit of everything based around retro gaming. And of course, check us out online on our website, www.retropieguy.com. Thanks for watching.